I discovered what Bigfoot really is, and the Pentagon destroyed my life to keep me quiet. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Torrens. I was a military geneticist at Fort Detrick. In 1997, they pulled me from my anthrax research to analyze tissue samples from dead Special Forces soldiers. What I found was impossible. Human DNA fused with extinct species, plus engineered sequences that shouldn't exist. I found classified files from Project Wildman, a 1960s program that transformed volunteer soldiers into enhanced superbeings. 7 survived the procedures. 4 escaped into the Cascade Mountains in '68. They've been breeding ever since. I saw Pentagon satellites tracking hundreds of them, moving in military formations through our national forests. The government knew. They've always known. When I tried to expose this, they locked me in a psychiatric ward for 6 months, diagnosed me with schizophrenia, threatened my family. My wife died in an accident that wasn't an accident. My daughters think I'm insane. Now I'm dying of cancer with weeks to live, and I'm releasing everything: the genetic proof, the underground facilities, the extermination protocol, ready to eliminate 10,000 creatures if they're ever exposed. What happens when the monsters in our woods are actually abandoned American soldiers? I died 6 months ago. At least, that's what the oncologist told me would happen by now. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer doesn't negotiate. But here I am in this Virginia hospice, still breathing, still remembering, and finally ready to tell you what your government has been hiding for 60 years. For 15 years, I was a military geneticist at Fort Detrick's United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID. I held top-secret clearance. I worked with anthrax, plague, Marburg, diseases that could wipe out cities. I've seen things that would make most people lose sleep, for years. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered in 1997. The morphine drip they've got me on makes everything feel distant, like I'm watching my life through frosted glass. But I remember that spring with perfect clarity, every detail, every moment that led to my destruction. You need to understand something first. I wasn't some conspiracy theorist. I published papers in peer-reviewed journals. I briefed generals on biological warfare threats. My work on hemorrhagic fever detection saved lives during the Ebola outbreak in Zaire. I'm telling you this because when the disinformation starts, and it will start, they'll paint me as another delusional veteran with PTSD. They'll point to my psychiatric discharge, the 6 months I spent in Walter Reed's secure ward. They'll mention the prescriptions for antipsychotics I never took, but I kept the evidence. 27 years of evidence, hidden in places they never thought to look. USB drives, sealed in plastic, buried under my mother's headstone. Laboratory notebooks and safety deposit boxes under assumed names. Photographs on encrypted servers in countries that don't cooperate with US intelligence. The non-disclosure agreements I signed are comprehensive. 312 pages of legal documentation that essentially states if I ever speak about Project Wildman, I face life in military prison, minimum. There are addendums that are more creative with their threats. My wife Catherine died in a car accident 5 years ago, brake failure on a straight road, no traffic, perfect weather. My daughters won't speak to me anymore. They think my mental illness drove their mother to distraction. Maybe that's kinder than knowing the truth. But cancer has a way of reorganizing your priorities. When they told me I had 3 months to live, that was 8 months ago, now I realized I had nothing left to lose. They can't prosecute a dead man. They can't threaten someone who's already buried his family. I need to tell you about the genetic sequences I analyzed, about the chromosomal modifications that shouldn't have been possible with 1960s technology, about the underground facilities beneath our national forests, about why Bigfoot sightings have increased 300% in the last decade, about why the government purchased 40 million acres of protected wilderness in strategic locations across North America. Most importantly, I need to tell you about the creatures themselves, because they're not what you think they are. They're not some undiscovered primate species. They're not missing links or surviving Gigantopithecus. They're something far worse. They're us. Or rather, they're what we tried to make of ourselves. The nurse is coming in now, checking my IV, adjusting the bed. She smiles at me with that practiced hospice kindness. She has no idea that the man dying in room 37 once held the proof that would shatter everything America believes about its government, about evolution, about what's really out there in the woods, watching, waiting, and multiplying. My hands are steady as I speak into this recorder. That surprises me. After 27 years of silence, I thought they'd shake. but there's peace in finally telling the truth. It started with a phone call at 2 in the morning, April 15th, 1997. The secure phone in my bedroom had only rung twice in 5 years. Both times were national emergencies, once for the anthrax letters, once for a suspected weaponized flu strain from North Korea that turned out to be naturally occurring. So when it rang that April morning, Catherine didn't even stir. She'd learned not to ask questions. "Colonel Torrens," the voice said, "report to Building 470, USA Marid, 0600 hours. Bring your go bag. Classification, level Umbra. Umbra, above, top secret." Above anything I'd worked on before, I knew. Building 470 existed a windowless concrete structure on the far edge of Fort Detrick that most personnel assumed was storage. My badge had never granted access before. When I arrived, 2 military police officers checked my identification 3 times, made 2 phone calls, then escorted me through a series of underground tunnels I didn't know existed. Colonel Raymond Hecht was waiting in a conference room that could have been anywhere in any military facility, except for one detail: the walls were lined with copper mesh, a Faraday cage to prevent any electronic surveillance. "Tim," he said, not bothering with formalities, "we have a situation. 3 days ago, a Special Forces training exercise in the Cascade Mountains, Washington State, went wrong. 3 dead, 2 missing. The survivors are compromised." He slid a manila folder across the table. The photographs inside made me lean back in my chair. The bodies looked like they'd been hit by a grizzly, except grizzlies don't leave wounds like that. The bite radius suggested a jaw 3 times the size of any known terrestrial predator. The claw marks, if that's what they were 8 inches apart. "Bear attack?" I asked, knowing it wasn't. That's the official story. Hecht's West Point ring caught the fluorescent light as he tapped it against the table, a nervous tell I'd noticed before. The reality is more complicated. We recovered biological samples from the scene: hair, blood, tissue under one soldier's fingernails. The field lab couldn't identify it. Neither could the FBI. Neither could the CDC. "So you want me to sequence it? I want you to tell me what the hell killed 3 of my best soldiers." He paused. "You have 72 hours. You'll work alone. No assistance, no communication outside this building. There's a BSL-4 containment lab prepared for you on Sublevel 3. Biosafety Level 4, maximum containment, positive pressure suits, decontamination, showers. We used BSL-4 for Ebola, for weaponized smallpox. Whatever was in those samples, someone thought it was catastrophically dangerous. Sir, if this is a biological weapon, it's not." He cut me off. "At least, not in any conventional sense. The samples show no pathogenic properties. No virus, no bacteria, no toxins. But the genetic material." He stood up, walked to the door, then turned back. "Tim, what I'm about to show you doesn't leave this room." He produced another folder, this one marked with classification stamps I'd never seen before. Inside was a single page, a preliminary genetic analysis from someone who'd clearly given up trying to make sense of it. Handwritten in the margin were 3 words: "This isn't possible." The genome map showed mammalian DNA, but wrong. Like someone had taken human chromosomes and played God with them, inserting sequences that shouldn't exist, activating genes that should have been dormant for millions of years. The tech who ran this had a nervous breakdown, Hecht said quietly. He's currently sedated at Bethesda. His last coherent statement was that we're not dealing with a new species. We're dealing with something manufactured. I looked at the scattered data points on the page. Even from this preliminary analysis, I could see markers for enhanced muscle density, modified bone structure, redundant organ systems. This wasn't evolution, this was engineering. Sir, the technology to do this didn't exist when this was done. He finished my thought. According to isotope dating of the recovered tissue, these modifications are at least 30 years old, possibly more. The room felt smaller suddenly, the copper mesh on the walls like a cage. 72 hours, Colonel Torrens. Find out what we're dealing with. The BSL-4 lab was 40 feet underground, accessible only through 3 separate airlocks. I'd worked in maximum containment before, but never alone. Usually you had a partner, someone watching your back, checking your suit seals. This time, there was nobody. The positive pressure suit made every movement deliberate. The constant rush of filtered air was like white noise in my ears. On the stainless steel table in front of me, sealed in containment vessels, were the samples that had killed 3 soldiers. I started with the hair. Under the microscope, it looked almost human, but the diameter was wrong, twice as thick as any human hair I'd ever analyzed. The medulla pattern showed characteristics of multiple species. That should have been impossible. You don't get hybrid hair structure in nature. The blood samples were even more disturbing. The red blood cells were 30% larger than human normal, with a hemoglobin variant I'd never seen. It would allow for vastly superior oxygen carrying capacity. Someone could run for hours without getting winded with blood like this, but it was the tissue sample that made me step back from the present table. The muscle fibers were all wrong. In normal human muscle, you have a specific ratio of fast-twitch to slow-twitch fibers. This sample showed a third type I'd only seen mentioned in theoretical papers, a hybrid fiber that could function as both, switching between explosive power and sustained endurance. The density was off the charts. 1 square inch of this muscle tissue could generate 3 times the force of an Olympic powerlifter's. I ran the genetic sequencer, watching as the machine parsed through billions of base pairs. The results started populating my screen, and with each line of data, my understanding of what was possible began to crumble. The genome was predominantly human, about 70% standard Homo sapiens, but the remaining 30% was a nightmare of evolutionary impossibilities. I found markers from Denisovans, a sister species to Neanderthals that went extinct 40,000 years ago. There were sequences from Homo heidelbergensis, gone for 300,000 years. And scattered throughout were genes I couldn't identify at all, except they showed clear signs of artificial insertion. The insertion sites were marked by palindromic repeats, like signatures. Someone had been using restriction enzymes to cut and splice DNA, but the technique was crude, almost primitive. CRISPR-Cas9, our modern gene editing tool, wasn't developed until 2012. This work showed evidence of zinc finger nucleases, a much older, less precise method that barely functioned in the 1960s. Yet somehow, it had worked. The chromosomes were stable. The mutations were inheritable. I cross-referenced the military medical database, searching for any similar genetic patterns. My clearance gave me access to files going back to World War II. What I found made my hands shake inside the suit's thick gloves. 1973, 3 Marines disappeared during a training exercise at Camp Pendleton. Bodies never faced. Recovered, but blood found at the scene showed anomalous genetic markers. 1979, an Army Ranger unit reported killing a hostile combatant in the Olympic National Forest. The body was classified and transported to Fort Detrick. Genetic analysis showed significant deviation from human baseline. 1985, Air Force personnel at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana reported an intruder that moved unlike anything human. Blood recovered from the perimeter fence showed the same anomalies I was seeing now. Each file had been sealed, classified beyond top secret, and marked with a project name, Wildman Protocol Failures. I searched for Project Wildman in the database. Access denied. I tried different approaches, different search terms. Nothing. But then I noticed something odd in the metadata of the sealed files. They all referenced a storage location, Building 470, Sublevel 5, Vault 12. I was in Building 470, on Sublevel 4. There was another level below me, and according to these files, it contained 20 years of genetic evidence that someone had been creating these things, not studying them, creating them. The ventilation system in my suit suddenly felt inadequate. I was sweating despite the cooling system. My breathing fogged the faceplate. Because if these genetic modifications were intentional, if someone had deliberately combined human DNA with extinct hominids and added synthetic enhancements, then the creatures that killed those soldiers weren't discoveries. They were products. And based on the dates in these files, they'd been breeding in the wild for at least 30 years. I worked through the night, mapping every genetic anomaly, documenting every impossible sequence. By 4 a.m, I'd identified 17 distinct modifications that enhanced physical capabilities beyond anything in nature. The eyes showed rhodopsin variants that would allow near-perfect night vision. The bone density was 40% higher than human average, with a trabecular structure that resembled industrial composite materials more than biological tissue. The cardiovascular system had redundancies I'd only seen in deep-diving mammals, secondary capillary networks that could maintain organ function even with massive blood loss. But it was the brain tissue that disturbed me most. The samples were damaged, but I could see evidence of an enlarged amygdala and a modified prefrontal cortex. These creatures wouldn't just be stronger and faster than humans. They'd be capable of complex reasoning, planning, maybe even language. I was documenting the neurological modifications when I heard the elevator. Nobody should have been coming down here at 4:30 in the morning. I saved my work to an encrypted drive and waited. The figure who entered the lab wasn't Colonel Hecht. It was a janitor, an older man with a slight limp. He pushed his cart to my workstation and began emptying the wastebasket. Then, without looking at me, he placed a manila envelope on my desk. "You've got 30 seconds before the cameras come back online," he said quietly. I grabbed the envelope. He was already heading for the door. "Wait, who?" "Someone who knows what you're looking at used to be human." The door sealed behind him. Inside the envelope were photocopied documents, old enough that the paper was yellowing at the edges. The header on the first page made my blood run cold. Project Wildman, Enhanced Soldier Initiative, Classification Ultra, January 1962. The project summary read like science fiction. During the Cold War, military intelligence had received reports that the Soviets were attempting to create hybrid soldiers by combining human DNA with great apes. The US couldn't fall behind in this biological arms race. But rather than using known primates, Project Wildman proposed using genetic material from unidentified bipedal specimens, captured in Tibet during a CIA operation in 1959. The next document was a testimony transcript from Dr. Friedrich Kellner, dated March 1962. Kellner had been brought to the US through Operation Paperclip, the secret program that recruited German scientists after World War II. "The specimens from Tibet are not apes," his testimony read. "They show signs of parallel evolution, a separate branch that diverged from Homo erectus. The Soviets call them Almas. The locals call them Yeti. The genetic material is remarkably compatible with human DNA, more so than any known primate. Hybridization is not only possible, but has already been achieved in preliminary experiments." I flipped to the next page, a progress report from 1965. 23 test subjects, all military volunteers who'd been told they were testing performance-enhancing drugs. The modifications were successful in 7 subjects. 4 died from organ failure. 12 showed no changes. But the 7 who survived weren't just enhanced, they were transformed. Strength increased by 400%, speed and endurance off the charts, night vision, enhanced healing, resistance to cold that allowed them to operate in Arctic conditions without gear. The military had created super soldiers. But something had gone wrong. The final document in the packet was a termination order from November 1968. It described an uncontained breach at a facility in Washington state. 4 modified subjects had escaped during a transfer. They killed 6 guards and disappeared into the Cascade Mountains. Search teams found evidence they'd met up with others, wild specimens that had never been in the program. The termination order included satellite coordinates for 12 locations across the Pacific Northwest, where feral populations may have established breeding colonies. It recommended complete sanitization of these areas. But there was a handwritten note at the bottom, in different ink. Sanitization, attempted December 68 through February 69. Failed. Populations have dispersed. Recommend reclassification to long-term containment. I sat back in my containment suit, the weight of what I'd discovered pressing down on me. The government hadn't discovered Bigfoot. They'd created it. And when their creations escaped, when they started breeding with the wild populations that already existed, they'd covered it up. The hair and tissue samples on my table weren't from some unknown species. They were from the descendants of American soldiers who'd volunteered for an experiment that had turned them into something no longer fully human. The termination order sat in front of me like a death sentence. Not for the project, for everyone who knew about it. I kept reading Dr. Kellner's testimony, his broken English making the horror somehow worse. The specimens we captured in Tibet, they were not animals. They showed intelligence. They drew symbols in the dirt. When we took blood samples, the others, the ones we hadn't caught, they came to the fence at night. They didn't attack. They watched. They remembered our faces. Kellner had been recruited specifically because of his work in the German eugenics programs. The Americans who brought him over through Operation Paperclip knew exactly what kind of scientist they were getting. Someone who wouldn't hesitate to blend human and non-human genetics. Someone who'd already crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. His notes described the first successful hybrid, designated Subject Alpha, a volunteer from Fort Bragg, Staff Sergeant Mitchell Barnes, who'd been told he was testing a new performance enhancement drug. The transformation took 6 weeks. By week 3, Barnes had grown 4 inches. His body hair had thickened. His jaw had begun to extend. Subject shows remarkable adaptation, Kellner wrote. Muscle mass increased by 200%. Able to run 40 miles without rest. Night vision superior to any technological enhancement. But psychological changes are concerning. Subject has become increasingly nonverbal. Shows agitation in confined spaces. Has begun to vocalize in patterns we cannot interpret. By week 6, Barnes was no longer recognizable as human. 7 feet tall, covered in thick brown hair, with a skull that had reformed to accommodate a larger brain case. But the worst part was in the final assessment. Subject retains human intelligence but can no longer speak. Written communication suggests full awareness of transformation. Extreme psychological distress noted. Barnes had known what was happening to him. He'd felt himself changing, losing his humanity piece by piece, and he couldn't stop it. The program had created 6 more, like Barnes, before the escape. The official report was sanitized, clinical, but between the lines, I could read the truth. The modified subjects had planned their escape. They'd waited for a shift change, a moment when security was weakest. They'd worked together, communicated without words. The guards never stood a chance. But what happened next was even more disturbing. The escaped subjects didn't run randomly into the wilderness. They went to specific locations, places where sighting reports had been filed for decades. They found others of their kind, the wild populations that had existed long before Project Wildman. A secondary document, dated 1971, described the military's attempts to track the escaped subjects. Infrared satellites had picked up heat signatures moving through the Cascade Range in patterns that suggested not just intelligence but organization, family groups, hunting parties. Even what appeared to be gatherings, dozens of creatures coming together in remote valleys. The populations were breeding, the modified genetics were being passed on. I found a genetic analysis from 1989. Second-generation offspring showed interesting changes. The artificial modifications were stabilizing, integrating with the natural genome. The creatures were becoming a true species, neither human nor animal, but something entirely new. The file included a population estimate that made my stomach turn. By 1997, the year I was reading this, they estimated between 800 and 1,200 individuals across the Pacific Northwest. If their growth rate continued, by 2020 there could be 5,000. The final document in the packet was different. It was recent, printed on modern paper. A single paragraph. Colonel Torrens, your analysis confirms what we've known for 30 years. The Project Wildman subjects have established a permanent presence. Containment is no longer possible. Your choice now is simple. Join the management protocol or become a liability. You have 12 hours to decide. Sublevel 5. Vault 12 contains everything. If you access it, there's no going back. I looked at my watch. 4 hours until my deadline for the genetic analysis. 8 hours until whatever this 12-hour ultimatum meant. I made my choice. I was going to Sublevel 5. Colonel Hecht was waiting for me when I emerged from the decontamination chamber at 7 a.m. He wasn't alone. 2 men in black suits flanked him, military intelligence by their bearing, though they wore no insignia. Tim, Hecht said, and I noticed he wasn't tapping his ring. He was perfectly still. We need to discuss your theoretical conclusions. Theoretical. There was that word again. The one that meant we're going to talk about this without admitting anything. My analysis is complete, I said carefully. The genetic material shows significant anomalies. Anomalies, one of the intelligence officers repeated. Could you be more specific? I had to play this right. They knew what I'd found, they had to. This was a test to see if I'd keep my mouth shut or become a problem. The samples appear to contain a mixture of human and unknown primate DNA, I said, with some sequences that suggest genetic modification, though that would require technology that didn't exist when these modifications apparently occurred. The second intelligence officer opened a briefcase and pulled out a tablet. He showed me surveillance footage from my lab. There I was, reading the Project Wildman documents. They'd been watching the entire time. Theoretical conclusions, Colonel Torrens, Heck said slowly, can be dangerous if they're shared with the wrong people. You understand that, don't you? I understand that my job is to analyze genetic material and report my findings through proper channels. And those findings? This was the moment. I could tell them everything. about the escaped experiments, about barns, about the breeding populations, or I could pretend I hadn't connected the dots. My findings, I said, are that we're dealing with an unknown species that shares significant genetic markers with humans, possibly a parallel evolutionary branch. The similarities suggest convergent evolution rather than direct relation. The two intelligence officers exchanged glances. Hecht's ring tapping started again. And the evidence of genetic modification? The first officer asked. Could be natural mutations. Without access to comparative samples from multiple generations, it's impossible to determine if these are engineered changes or evolutionary adaptations. Hecht stood up. Colonel Torrance, you've been granted extended archive access to complete your report. 12 additional hours. I trust you'll use that time wisely. After they left, I sat in my lab, knowing I was at a crossroads. They were giving me 12 hours to either bury what I'd learned or dig deeper. The mention of archive access wasn't random. They wanted me to find something, or they were testing to see if I would. I made my decision. I accessed the archive system and searched for sublevel 5. The elevator required special authorization, but somehow my badge worked. As I descended, I wondered if this was planned, if they wanted me here. The doors opened to a corridor I'd never seen, one that couldn't officially exist. At the end was Vault 12. Inside were filing cabinets, stretching back into darkness. Thousands of files, decades of documentation. And in the center, a reading table with a single folder already placed there, like someone knew I was coming. The folder was labeled Current Operations, Pacific Northwest Biological Anomaly Management Protocol. Inside were satellite photos from the previous week, thermal imaging showing groups of large bipedal signatures moving through the Cascades, the Olympics, the Blue Mountains. The resolution was incredible. I could see individual creatures, their movement patterns, even what appeared to be crude structures they'd built, but it was the population estimate that stopped my breathing. 2,300 individuals, active breeding populations in 17 locations, territorial expansion of approximately 50 miles per decade. At current growth rates, they would reach the outskirts of Seattle by 2040. The next document outlined the government's response. Not elimination that had been deemed impossible after the failed attempts in the 60s. Instead, a management protocol. Purchase large tracts of wilderness under conservation pretexts. Control human access. Monitor the populations. And most importantly, maintain absolute secrecy. Because if the public learned that the government had created these beings, that American soldiers had been transformed into monsters and released into the wild, the scandal would destroy every institution involved. The final page was a signature form. By signing, I would join the management protocol. I would continue my research, help track the creatures, and maintain the secret. Or I could refuse. Though the form didn't say what would happen if I did, I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in front of the archive terminal, pulling file after file, each one worse than the last. Operation Forest Keeper, 1994. 6 rangers on a training exercise in Mount Rainier National Park reported hostile wildlife contact. 2 soldiers missing, never found. The after-action report included thermal satellite footage that I had to watch 3 times to believe. 14 large bipedal heat signatures moving in formation through the tree line. Not randomly. In formation, like they'd been trained. The timestamp showed 0300 hours. The creatures were using darkness for tactical advantage. I found budget documents hidden in appropriation bills. $40 million in 1991 for wildlife management in national forests. $60 million in 1995 for ecological preservation zones that happened to overlap with every major sighting cluster. By 2000, they were spending $100 million annually on something called the Biological Anomaly Management Protocol. They weren't trying to catch them anymore. They were managing them, like a population of endangered wolves. Except wolves don't carry the DNA of American soldiers who volunteered to serve their country. A restricted file from 1996 made me close my eyes and breathe deep. A family of hikers in the North Cascades had gone missing. The search and rescue team found their camp destroyed, their bodies arranged in a pattern that suggested not random violence, but communication. A warning. The medical examiner's report was sealed, but someone had scrawled in the margin, "They're learning." They remember what we did. I pulled up current satellite imagery from the coordinates in the old Project Wildman files. The computer required special authorization codes. I shouldn't have known, but someone had. Written them on a post-it note stuck under the keyboard. Another test? Another trap? I didn't care anymore. The images loaded slowly. Infrared scans from the previous week, covering a 50-square-mile grid in the Cascade Range. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I adjusted the heat threshold, and they appeared. Dozens of them. Moving through the forest in small groups, maintaining specific distances from each other. Patrol patterns. They were running patrols, just like the military had taught their ancestors. But it was the structures that made me lean back in my chair. Hidden under the tree canopy, barely visible even in infrared, were what looked like shelters, not random stick formations, but deliberate construction. They were building communities. I found a sub-file labeled Generation Analysis and opened it despite my better judgment. Photos spanning 40 years, starting with the original escaped subjects. The first generation had been obviously non-human, their modifications crude and horrific. But each subsequent generation looked more refined. The genetic modifications were integrating, smoothing out. The most recent photos, taken by trail cameras in 2016, showed creatures that could almost pass for human at a distance. Almost. The proportions were still wrong, the gait distinctive, but they were evolving towards something that could potentially integrate with human society. A population dynamics model predicted that by 2050, there could be 10,000 of them. By 2070, if growth rates continued, 50,000. Another document outlined contingency planning. Protocol 7, complete elimination if public discovery became imminent. The military had mapped out a systematic extermination plan using thermobaric weapons, claiming forest fires as cover. They'd kill them all, rather than admit what they'd done. I downloaded everything onto encrypted drives, my hands working automatically while my mind reeled. The timer on my archive access showed 3 hours remaining. 3 hours to gather evidence of the greatest cover-up in American history. Then I found the video file that changed everything. Security footage from a facility in Montana dated 2 weeks ago. A creature in a cage, but not acting like an animal. It was using sign language. Simple signs, but deliberate. Food, water, and one that made my blood freeze, home. They'd captured one recently, and it was trying to communicate. The video file was 43 minutes long. I watched every second. The creature, I couldn't think of it as it anymore. Not after seeing those eyes sat in a reinforced steel enclosure somewhere in Montana. The facility looked military, but off the books, no insignia visible anywhere. The timestamp showed April 3rd, 1997. 2 weeks ago, a man in surgical scrubs entered the frame, approaching the cage slowly. The creature watched him with an intelligence that was undeniable. When the man held up a water bottle, the creature made the sign for water again. Not mimicry, understanding. The man spoke, though the audio was muted. The creature tilted its head, processing. Then it stood up, and I got my first clear look at what 30 years of wild breeding had produced. 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair, but the posture was human. The face was the disturbing part features that sat in the uncanny valley between man and ape. The brow ridge was pronounced but not primitive. The eyes were deep set but showed whites like a human's. The jaw was heavy but not prognathous. The hands were what convinced me. Long fingers, opposable thumbs, and when the creature gripped the cage bars, I could see old scars that looked like defensive wounds. This thing had been in fights. It had survived. The medical files for the Cascade Mountain survivors made more sense now. Sergeant Rodriguez's testimony, recorded before sedation, described his encounter in detail. I hadn't understood before. It didn't just attack us, Rodriguez had said, his voice shaking on the audio file. It watched us first. For hours. We could feel it watching. When Martinez went to take a piss, that's when it moved. It waited until we were separated. It knew our patterns. And the sounds it made. God help me, it sounded like it was trying to talk. Rodriguez described the creature wearing fragments of old military gear. I'd dismissed this as trauma-induced hallucination, but now I checked the evidence logs. Dog tags recovered at the scene. Peterson, J, serial number 39472816. I searched for Peterson in the military database. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, Fort Lewis, reported missing during a training exercise in November 1971. The search had been called off after 2 weeks, presumed dead. But he hadn't died. He'd been taken or transformed or both. The implications made me physically ill. How many missing soldiers over the past 30 years weren't actually missing? How many had been infected, changed, integrated into these populations? I found another file, this one from a geneticist at the Centers for Disease Control who'd analyzed tissue samples in 1993 without knowing their origin. Her report was clinical, but her conclusions were revolutionary. The genetic modifications appear to be inheritable, but also transmissible through certain bodily fluids. The mechanism resembles a retrovirus, but with unprecedented precision in genetic insertion. Subjects exposed to sufficient biological material could theoretically undergo gradual transformation. Transmissible. The modifications could spread. A handwritten note was paperclipped to the report. Researcher relocated. All samples destroyed. No further inquiry authorized. The next document showed thermal imaging from Afghanistan, dated 1996. The Hindu Kush Mountains, nowhere near the Pacific Northwest. 3 large bipedal signatures moving through terrain where no human could survive without equipment. The briefing note suggested these were parallel developments, but I knew better. The experiments hadn't been limited to America. How many other countries had their own Project Wildmans? How many populations of these creatures existed worldwide? I copied everything, my external drives filling with terabytes of evidence, genetic sequences, satellite imagery, casualty reports, budget allocations, and that horrible video of the creature signing home, over and over. With 30 minutes left on my access, I found the most recent assessment, dated 1 week ago. It recommended expanding the containment zones by purchasing an additional 12 million acres of protected wilderness. The growth projections had been updated. They were reproducing faster than expected. Some females were having twins, even triplets. The final line of the assessment haunts me still. Recommend considering integration protocols if containment fails. They're becoming too human to eliminate, too numerous to hide. My access terminated at exactly 7 p.m. I sat in the dark archive room with 5 encrypted drives hidden in my lab coat. They came for me at 3 in the morning. Not dramatically, not with sirens or drawn weapons. Just 2 military police officers standing at my lab door, polite but firm. "Colonel Torrens, you need to come with us." I'd hidden the encrypted drives in places they'd never think to look, inside old equipment scheduled for disposal, taped under drawers in abandoned offices. But I knew this was coming. You don't access files like those without triggering something. The ride to Walter Reed Army Medical Center took 40 minutes. They put me in the back of an unmarked van with no windows. The MPs didn't speak. When we arrived, I wasn't taken to the main hospital, but to a separate building I'd never noticed before, despite working at military facilities for 15 years. The psychiatric ward was clean, quiet, and secure. Too secure for normal patients. Magnetic locks, reinforced glass, and cameras in every corner. They gave me a room private, which should have been my first warning that I wasn't here for treatment. Dr. Patricia Vance introduced herself the next morning. Mid-40s, sharp eyes behind designer glasses, and a way of taking notes even when she appeared to be casually listening. She had the kind of smile that never reached those eyes. "Colonel Torrens, you've been under considerable stress," she began, settling into the chair across from me. "Your supervisors are concerned about some unusual behavior, accessing classified files without authorization, making claims about government experiments. Would you like to talk about what you've been experiencing?" I recognized the technique, make me think I was driving the conversation, while she extracted everything. I'd been trained to resist interrogation. But this wasn't torture. This was worse. This was being treated like I was insane. "I was assigned to analyze genetic samples," I said carefully. "I followed proper procedures." "Of course," she made a note. "And these samples, they showed you evidence of enhanced soldiers, genetic experiments." The way she said it, with just enough skepticism to sound concerned rather than dismissive. She already knew everything. This wasn't about finding out what I knew, it was about documenting how much I'd say. The genetic anomalies were consistent with deliberate modification, I said, keeping my voice clinical. The evidence suggested, she leaned forward slightly. "But you went beyond suggestion, didn't you? You accessed files you weren't authorized to see. You created elaborate theories about escaped experiments breeding in our forests. That must have been frightening, thinking you'd discovered something so massive." Over the next 6 weeks, we played this game daily. She'd probe, I'd deflect. But I started noticing things. Other patients in the ward, all military. A Marine who'd whisper about things in the mountains during group therapy. An Air Force pilot who'd been grounded after reporting impossible heat signatures over Montana. An Army Ranger who just sat there, staring, occasionally signing words in ASL that looked like he was trying to communicate with something that wasn't there. Week 3, Vance showed me my own brain scans. See these areas of unusual activity? She pointed to colored regions on the image, consistent with paranoid schizophrenia. The stress of your work, the isolation, it's created false patterns in your mind. You're connecting things that aren't connected. But I'd seen those same brain patterns before, in the medical files from 1997. In soldiers who'd been exposed to the creatures, the modifications weren't just physical, they affected neural chemistry too. Even minimal exposure, just being near them, could trigger changes in brain function. I need to contact my wife, I said during week 5. Catherine has been informed of your situation, Vance replied smoothly. She understands you need treatment. But something in her eyes flickered when she said it. Catherine hadn't been informed. Catherine was probably being told I was on a classified assignment. Or maybe they were telling her worse things, creating distance, isolation. I stopped talking after that. Just nodded, agreed, took whatever medications they gave me and palmed them, flushing them later. I played the recovering patient, the officer who'd had a breakdown but was getting better. Week 6, everything changed. The man who called himself Mr. Gray arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 6 weeks into my stay at Walter Reed. No first name, no title beyond Mr., and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything and cared about none of it. He didn't come to my room. They brought me to him, in a conference room that felt more like an interrogation chamber. No windows, one door, and that familiar copper mesh in the walls. He sat across from a metal table with a single manila folder in front of him. "Colonel Torrens," he said, not looking up from the folder. "You've created a problem." I stayed silent. In interrogation resistance training, they teach you that silence is often your best defense. You accessed classified materials beyond your authorization level. You copied those materials. You've been discussing sensitive information with medical staff. He finally looked up. Any one of these actions could result in life imprisonment under the Espionage Act. I was assigned to analyze. You were assigned to analyze genetic samples, nothing more. He opened the folder and spread out photographs. My house, Catherine working in her garden, my daughters, Rebecca and Jennifer, walking to their high school. The photos were recent. Rebecca had just dyed her hair black 2 weeks before I'd been taken to Walter Reed. In the photo, the color was fresh. "Rebecca's considering MIT for next year," Gray said conversationally. "Early admission, remarkable young woman. Jennifer's more artistic, isn't she? That performing arts school in Richmond would be perfect for her." My hands clenched under the table. "Catherine takes Route 7 to her job at the hospital," he continued. "Leaves at 7:15 every morning. That stretch near Difficult Run can be dangerous. Lots of accidents over the years. Brake failures, mostly. What do you want?" He smiled then, but it was like watching a corpse try to remember how. "Your cooperation, your silence, your signature." He produced a new document, a medical discharge form citing paranoid schizophrenia brought on by work-related stress, full benefits, disability compensation, and a monthly check that was surprisingly generous. All I had to do was sign, accept the diagnosis, and never speak about what I'd learned. And if I refuse, then you'll face trial for treason. Your wife will lose her job, security concerns, you understand. Your daughter's college applications will be flagged. Background checks will find interesting things. He paused. Of course, that assumes you make it to trial. The psychiatric medications you're on can have unfortunate interactions. Sometimes patients have adverse reactions, heart failure, strokes. I looked at the pills I'd been palming and flushing. Maybe they knew. Maybe this was just another test. "I want guarantees," I said. "My family is left alone. No surveillance, no accidents. As long as you maintain your end of the agreement." I signed. What else could I do? They had my family. They released me 2 weeks later with a bottle of antipsychotics I'd never take, a diagnosis that would follow me forever, and the knowledge that I was living under a sword that could fall at any moment. Catherine tried to understand. She'd been told I'd had a breakdown, that the stress of working with dangerous pathogens had finally caught up with me. The doctors had shown her brain scans, probably fabricated, and convinced her I needed support, not questions. We moved 3 times in the next 2 years. Each time, I'd notice things. A van that stayed too long on our street. Neighbors who asked too many questions. Phone calls with subtle clicks that meant someone was listening. I went from being a respected military scientist to teaching basic biology at community colleges under an assumed name. Dr. Timothy Torrens became Professor Tim Torres, and nobody questioned why someone with my credentials was teaching Introduction to Cell Biology to freshmen. But I kept watching. I kept collecting evidence. Every news story about a missing hiker, I'd map it. Every blurry photo of Bigfoot, I'd analyze it. Every military exercise in national forests, I'd document it. I built my own database, encrypted and hidden, tracking the expansion of the creature's territory. The pattern was undeniable. They were moving east, following mountain ranges and river valleys. The sightings were increasing exponentially. By 2010, they'd reached Colorado. By 2015, Arkansas. By 2020, there were credible reports from West Virginia. And through it all, I kept silent. Because Catherine was alive. Because my daughters got to go to college, get married, have lives. Until Catherine died in 2019. Single car accident, brake failure, Route 7, near difficult run. Just like Gray had described 22 years earlier. 20 years, that's how long I kept my mouth shut. I became someone else entirely. Tim Torres, the community college professor who taught freshman biology and never talked about his past. I graded papers on mitosis while tracking migration patterns of creatures that shouldn't exist. I taught the Krebs cycle while analyzing grainy trail cam footage from Arkansas. Catherine never knew. Even as I moved us from Virginia to Ohio to Pennsylvania, always with vague explanations about better job opportunities, she trusted me. She'd catch me staring at maps sometimes, marking locations with colored pins, but she'd just squeeze my shoulder and ask if I wanted coffee. The guilt of lying to her ate at me like acid. My daughters grew up thinking their father had mental health issues. The prescription bottles I never opened sat in medicine cabinets like props in a play. Rebecca would sometimes ask if I was taking my medication. Jennifer just stopped making eye contact when she visited. But I watched. I documented. I knew things the public wouldn't learn for years. The Patterson footage from 2004? I could tell from the gait pattern it was a third-generation creature. The Ohio howls recorded in 2012? Those were territorial calls, and the frequency suggested at least 6 individuals. The Minnesota sightings of 2017? That was a new breeding population, 500 miles from the nearest known group. They were expanding faster than the government projections. By my calculations, they'd reach a population of 5,000 by 2030, not 2050. I tried to warn people indirectly. Anonymous tips to researchers. Unmarked packages to Bigfoot investigators with GPS coordinates. But every time I pushed too hard, I'd get a reminder. A photo of Rebecca at her wedding slipped under my door. Jennifer's new address, written on my windshield in the morning dew. Then came April 3rd, 2019. Catherine was driving to her shift at the hospital. Route 7, the stretch near Difficult Run I'd driven hundreds of times, checking for surveillance, noting escape routes. The police said brake failure, no skid marks. She went straight off the road into a tree at 60 miles per hour. At the funeral, a man I didn't recognize approached me. Black suit, government, haircut, eyes that reminded me of Mr. Gray. He shook my hand and said, "Our condolences on your accident." Accident, not loss. Accident. My daughters blamed me. Not directly, but I could see it in their eyes. If I hadn't been sick, if I hadn't moved us so many times, if I hadn't been paranoid, maybe their mother would have maintained her car better. Maybe she wouldn't have been so distracted. They stopped visiting. Phone calls became texts. Texts became silence. So I had nothing left to lose when the cancer diagnosis came in late 2023. Pancreatic, stage 4. 3 months to live, maybe 6 with treatment. I chose no treatment. I chose truth instead. Foster found me first, not the other way around. December 2023. I was lying in a hospital bed, reading my own medical charts, when an encrypted message appeared on my phone. Just coordinates and a time. I recognized the encryption protocol military grade, the kind we'd used for classified communications. I met him in a diner off Interstate 81 in Pennsylvania, middle of nowhere, the kind of place truckers stopped at 3 a.m. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back corner where he could see both exits. Beard, baseball cap, flannel shirt, trying to look like a local, but the way he held himself, the constant environmental scanning, screamed Special Forces. "Colonel Torrens," he said quietly as I sat down. "Name's Foster. We have something in common." "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled, pulled out a tablet, and showed me drone footage. Night vision. Somewhere mountainous. The timestamp read September 15th, 2021. Location tag, Hindu Kush, Afghanistan. 3 large bipedal figures moving along a ridgeline. They moved, like the creatures from the Cascade footage, but adapted to different terrain. Higher altitude adaptations, leaner builds. "My unit was tracking Taliban through the mountains," Foster said. "Found something else instead. Command told us we were hallucinating from altitude sickness. But you can't hallucinate what drone cameras record." "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I know who you are, what you found, what they did to you." He leaned forward. "And because I know you're dying, which means you've got nothing left for them to threaten." He was right. With maybe 3 months left, what could they do to me? Foster had been collecting evidence for 3 years. Other soldiers who'd encountered creatures and been silenced. Drone operators who'd captured footage that was immediately classified. Even a Navy SEAL who swore he'd seen them in Alaska during Arctic training. "It's global," Foster said. "Every mountain range, every deep forest. Different adaptations, but same base genetics. The experiments weren't just here." He showed me more footage. The Ural Mountains in Russia, the Alps, the Andes, all showing similar heat signatures, similar movement patterns. 2021 Yosemite, he said, swiping to new footage. 50+ individuals moving in formation. "Look at this." The thermal imaging showed them moving in a perfect wedge formation, maintaining exact distances, responding to hand signals from what appeared to be a leader, military precision. They'd retained the training programmed into their ancestors' DNA. "I've got a contact at the Pentagon," Foster continued. "Says there's something called Protocol 7, complete extermination if they go public. Thermobaric weapons disguised as forest fires. I thought about the creature in the Montana facility, signing home over and over. They're not just animals," I said finally. "No, they're not. Which is why this needs to come out. Before the government decides they're too dangerous to exist." Foster provided me with terabytes of data, footage from 6 continents, military after-action reports, genetic analysis from a sympathetic scientist at the CDC who'd figured out what she was looking at. Even satellite imagery showing the underground facilities where living specimens were still being held. But the most disturbing file was from 2022. Someone at the Pentagon had run a computer simulation of creature population growth versus human expansion. The curves intersected in 2047. That's when they'd become impossible to hide. From this hospice bed, I need to tell you the worst part. The part that keeps me awake despite the morphine. The creatures are still evolving. A colleague I won't name, she's still working, still has a family, managed to analyze tissue samples from a creature killed in a vehicle collision in Oregon last year, 2023. 4th generation, possibly 5th. The genetic modifications that were crude and obvious in the 1st generation have integrated seamlessly. The chromosomes have stabilized. They're becoming a true species. But here's what terrifies me. They're becoming more human with each generation. The original escapees from 1968 looked like monsters. 8 feet tall, covered in thick fur, faces that were barely recognizable as once being human. But their children were different, smaller, more proportioned. By the 3rd generation, they could pass for human at a distance if you didn't look too closely. The Oregon specimen my colleague analyzed was 6'4". The body hair was present but fine, like that of some Mediterranean populations. The facial features, while still showing the pronounced brow and jaw, had softened. In another 2 generations, they might be able to walk among us. The breeding data Foster provided shows they're reproducing faster than any model predicted. Females are reaching sexual maturity at 12 years, having multiple offspring, often twins or triplets. The gestation period is only 7 months. A single breeding pair can produce 40 offspring in a 20-year period. Current population estimate, 8,000 individuals across North America alone. But the truly disturbing discovery came from analyzing their brain tissue. The modifications that enhanced their physical capabilities also affected cognitive function. The original subjects had IQs around 80 to 90. Their wild-born children tested higher. By the third generation, problem-solving abilities were exceeding human normal. They're not just getting more human-looking, they're getting smarter. Foster's drone footage from Yosemite shows them using tools not just rocks and sticks, but modified implements, shaped and prepared. They're creating semi-permanent structures, not just shelters, but what appear to be storage facilities, possibly even primitive workshops. The government knows this. They've been tracking the evolutionary progression since the 1980s. There's a classified report from 2019 projecting that by 2050, the creatures will have developed language complex enough to demand recognition. By 2060, they might seek integration with human society. Imagine that. The descendants of American soldiers, transformed against their will, returning to claim their place in the world that created and abandoned them. The Pentagon's response has been Protocol 7, complete extermination, if public discovery becomes inevitable. They have strike teams positioned near every known population center. If a creature is captured on clear video, if undeniable proof goes viral, they'll initiate thermobaric weapons, blamed on forest fires, complete sterilization of hundreds of square miles. They'll commit genocide rather than admit what they did. But even Protocol 7 might not work. The creatures have learned to avoid human contact, to stay hidden. They're teaching their young to fear us, to recognize our technology, our patterns. They're developing their own culture, their own strategies for survival. And, according to the projections, by 2050, their population will exceed 10,000. By 2070, 50,000, we're watching the birth of a new branch of humanity, and we're preparing to destroy it rather than face the shame of its creation. The USB drive that changed everything arrived on January 2nd, 2024. No return address, no note, just a padded envelope with my name and a single flash drive inside. 32 gigabytes of impossibility. The source was a Pentagon contractor, someone with cosmic clearance who'd finally had enough. They'd been maintaining the servers that stored 60 years of Project Wildman data, and they'd copied everything before a scheduled purge. The first video file was from 1964. Black and white, grainy, but unmistakable. An underground facility that the timestamp identified as being beneath what's now Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. 3 cells, reinforced steel and concrete, each containing one of the original test subjects. I watched Staff Sergeant Mitchell Barnes pace his cell, 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, but wearing his dog tags. He still wore his dog tags. When a researcher entered, Barnes didn't attack. He stood at attention, muscle memory from a man trapped in a monster's body. The next file showed the genetic modification protocols. Pages and pages of procedures that would make Nazi experiments look humane. Retroviral injections, bone marrow transplants, deliberate exposure to radiation to accelerate mutations. 43 volunteers entered the program. 7 survived the transformation. 4 escaped. But it was the current footage that made me call Foster immediately. There are 3 active facilities still operational. 1 beneath Shasta Trinity National Forest in California, 1 under Superior National Forest in Minnesota, and 1 under Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. Each facility contains living specimens, not captured wild creatures. These are direct descendants of the original test subjects bred in captivity for ongoing research. The Minnesota facility footage from November 2023 shows something that still makes my hands shake: a creature, 3rd or 4th generation, sitting at a table with a military researcher. They're playing chess. The creature is winning. Another file: a young creature, possibly 5 years old by their growth rate, being taught sign language. It knows over 300 signs. When asked what it wants, it signs: outside, trees, family. They know they're prisoners. They know they're being studied. They remember. The contractor included classified communications from the last year. The wild populations are organizing. Trail cameras have recorded gatherings of 50 or more individuals. They're sharing information, possibly warning each other about human activity. Some groups have completely abandoned areas where they'd lived for decades, moving deeper into wilderness as human. An expansion continues. But here's the revelation that made me decide to go fully public. The government is preparing for integration, not elimination. A classified Pentagon study from 2022 concluded that elimination is no longer possible. The populations are too large, too dispersed, too intelligent. Instead, they're developing controlled disclosure protocols, a gradual revelation of the truth over the next 25 years, culminating in official acknowledgement by 2050. They'll claim they just discovered these creatures. They'll present them as a natural species, a parallel evolution. They'll never admit to the experiments, the transformation of American soldiers, the decades of cover-ups and murdered witnesses. The USB also contained a list, 312 names. Military personnel, researchers, civilians who got too close to the truth. All died in accidents, suicides, sudden illnesses. Catherine's name was on it. I've copied everything. Sent it to journalists in 12 countries, scientists at major universities, even WikiLeaks. I've hidden drives in places they'll never find. Even if they stop me now, the truth will surface. Protocol 7 is scheduled for implementation if any disclosure occurs before 2035. We have 11 years before they decide between revelation and genocide. If you're listening to this, I'm probably dead. The cancer, or maybe something less natural. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you understand what's coming. I've given you the evidence, the genetic sequences, the classified documents, the footage. But evidence isn't enough if you don't know what to look for. So let me be specific about what's happening right now as you listen to this. First, the warning signs. If you live near any national forest, pay attention. Sudden closures for environmental protection that don't make sense. Military exercises in wilderness areas with no public notice. Construction of new ranger stations that look more like surveillance posts. These are containment expansions. Watch for missing persons patterns, not random disappearances, but clusters. Hikers, hunters, anyone who goes deep into wilderness and doesn't come back. The official searches that get called off too quickly. The bodies that are never found. The creatures avoid contact when possible, but territories overlap. Encounters happen. 3 facilities are still operational. Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, Washington, look for increased activity near the Dark Divide. Superior National Forest, Minnesota, unusual construction near the Boundary Waters. Monongahela National Forest, West Virginia, military vehicles on roads that supposedly don't exist. If you're a researcher, a journalist, anyone with a platform, the evidence is out there. I've sent packages to universities in 12 countries. The genetic data is with scientists who will recognize it for what it is. The footage is with journalists who aren't afraid of the truth. It will surface. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but soon. The creatures themselves, they're not your enemy. Remember that. They didn't choose this. They're the children and grandchildren of American soldiers who volunteered to serve their country and were transformed into something else. They retain memories, emotions, connections to their humanity. That creature signing home in the Montana facility, it knows what it lost. They're intelligent, they're organizing, they're watching us as much as we're watching them, and they remember what we did. If you encounter one, don't run. They're faster, don't shoot. They travel in groups, and you'll never see the others until it's too late. Stand still, avoid direct eye contact, and back away slowly. They understand submission. They remember military protocols. Show them you're not a threat, and they might let you leave. But here's what terrifies the government most. They're becoming us. Each generation more human in appearance, more sophisticated in behavior. By 2050, they could walk among us. By 2070, they could be us. The genetic modifications are stabilizing into something new, not human, not animal, but something in between that might be better than both. The Pentagon knows this. That's why Protocol 7 exists. Somewhere, right now, there are teams waiting for the order. One clear video, one captured specimen that goes public, and they'll initiate. They'll burn millions of acres and blame climate change. They'll commit genocide and call it forest management. Unless we stop them first. Unless the truth comes out on our terms, not theirs. I've done what I can. The evidence is scattered, hidden, protected. Even if they silence everyone who knows, the data will survive. The truth will surface. To my daughters, if you ever hear this, I'm sorry. Your mother's death wasn't an accident, but protecting you meant letting you. Believe it was. Every choice I made was to keep you safe. I hope someday you'll understand. To everyone else, look for the signs. Question the closures. Document everything. And remember, they're not monsters, they're not myths, they're the consequences of our ambition, living reminders of what happens when we try to play God. The nurse is here. She's asking if I need anything for the pain. No, I tell her. I've said what I needed to say.